Hey guys, we are back with another grading your footage, and today is slightly different because I'm going to grade first of all a camera that I haven't graded before, and also a kind of footage that I haven't graded before. Not that it's that much difference, but we're grading something from a wedding, or just one clip that Samuel from Jasper Multimedia was so kind to send me, and I'm super stoked to be grading this. Now, I have been playing around with it a little bit before I started recording this video, just to kind of see where the footage were at and the kind of quality that it was at as well, because it was shot with the FX3, which is a camera that I haven't graded from before, and it was shot in SLOG3 as well. So I just wanted to see what we could do and also kind of just get straight to the point on the video as well. So let's head into Davinci and get started with the grading, and I'm super excited to see what we can do and how far we can get. And also, before we do that, this is the clip in LOC, and Samuel also had the clip on YouTube, so I just took a quick screen grab here. You can find him down in the description as well, links to his YouTube channel and his Instagram channels as well. So with that said, let's jump into Davinci and get started. Inside Davinci here, right now we are in the edit page, but I'll just jump straight to the color page here, and this is the clip that we are working with. So let's first set up our node tree here. I'm just gonna build out the node tree and name it really quick, and then we can walk through what I've done so you don't have to sit and wait for that. All right, so I have my node tree set up here, and let's just walk through it before we start grading anything. The first node here is converting our log footage, SLOG3, to Davinci Wide Gamut. If you don't want to do it in Davinci Wide Gamut, you can just do the last node that we're going to get to in a second, where we'll get it from Davinci Wide Gamut to Rec 709. So you can just get it from SLOG3 to Rec 709 here. Then we have our white balance, our exposure, and our contrast. This will be our color correction nodes. Then we got our primaries, our hue, and our saturation, which will be our kind of basic color grading nodes to just tone in or tune in the tones a little bit. And then we got our maskings, which will be a focus mask with an outside node, highlights with some dehaze on, and our shadows for the mask. So this is what we're going to go through. I just labeled it already so that it's easy to follow along and see what I'm doing, and I'll try to explain everything that I do as good as I possibly can. So let's head into it. To convert the footage from SLOG3, we're going to use a color space transform. So I'm going to head into effects and find the color space transform down here, drag it on top of our node. And the input color space will be any one of these. I tried to work around and see if there was any kind of difference between the colors when I tried to select the different ones. I didn't see any difference at all. I don't shoot with Sony myself, so I don't exactly know what they do. So I just selected the Cine one, expecting that that would maybe be what it was shot in. It didn't seem to make a difference. So it was shot in SLOG3. And then I'm going to convert it to Davinci Wide Gamut and Davinci Intermediate. And now it's very flat, but if we head into our other node here and drag another color space transform on that, convert it from Davinci Wide Gamut, Davinci Intermediate to Rec 709 and Gamma 2.4. Here we go. Now we got quite a nice image already. I think this looks pretty great right off the bat. This is just converting it to Rec 709, and I'm already super stoked to see how good it looks from the FX3. I really think that it's a nice image right off the bat. Now for our color correction, we're going to work backwards. So we're going to start with the contrast, then adjust the exposure accordingly and see if we need to do any kind of white balance changes. So for the contrast, we're going to use the curves here. We're going to use the custom curves to create some contrast. So I'm just going to drag the shadows down and make a point in the highlights and drag those up. Now it looks very dark, but don't worry. This is what we're going to fix in the exposure, and we can see our waveform down here that it is definitely pushed towards the lower parts, and we have some parts that are way too dark right now. So with that said, I think this is a pretty good curve. I just want to make it soft but a little bit strong so we get some contrast into our image so we can make our subjects stand out more. The exposure, heading into that node, going to the primaries, and first up I want to increase the exposure a little bit. So we're going to drag the offset up to around 30, I think is pretty good. And already here we see that we get a lot more detail and information back. I'm going to increase the gamma a little bit as well, but not too much. I don't want the highlights here to get too far up because it is quite a dim shot. I'm going to drag the shadows or the lift here down just a little bit and maybe see if we should increase the gamma a little bit more, decrease the lift a little bit more. So with this, I think we got a pretty good image already. The only thing I'm seeing is that I think the background looks a little bit green, and I'm not sure if that comes from just what it looked like and what the scene was, but I'm gonna try and see if just adding like 2 or 3 magenta here in the tint on our white balance node is going to make a difference. And I think it just softens it up a little bit in terms of the green colors and balances it a little bit more. It's not a huge difference at all, but I'm just going to leave it there. It's probably not necessary, especially with what we're going to do for the rest now, but let's just leave it there. I like to have the white balance just corrected a little bit sometimes. For our primaries, I'm going to make some kind of teal and orange, but it's going to be very subtle because we don't want to mess anything up. I think it's already a quite beautiful shot. So I'm just going to try and add maybe 2 blue and 1 green to add a little bit of teal. Maybe remove 1 red to get that in. And now right off the bat, it looks very weird. But if we counter that a little bit by adding 1 red, removing 1 green, and then removing 2 blues, I think we're at an okay point now. We just added a little bit more warmth in the highlights and a little bit more teal to the greens and to the shadows around here. It does look a little bit too teal, too magenta to me right now. I think we might want to remove a little bit more of this blue and green. Maybe actually a little bit more blue. And now it's a little bit too green. So this is really about finding and fine-tuning the balance here. I'll zoom in a little bit, see where we're at, and I think this is pretty okay. The reason why I'm starting with the primaries is that then we can adjust our hues accordingly now. So we pretty much just, this is what it turned off, and now we just warmed up the floor and the highlights a little bit, the skin tones too, and made everything a little bit more teal in the shadows. So we're gonna head into the hues, and the first thing I'm gonna do here, the hues by the way is the curves again, but then we're going to use these 3, the hue versus hue, the hue versus sat, and the hue versus loom. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to lock in our skin tones because I don't want them to be affected with anything else that we do, and I also want to correct them as the first thing. So I'm going to use the qualifier tool, you get that here. I'm just going to drag on top of his skin colors here. I'm going to do that in all 3 channels, assuming that they have the same skin tones here. So just going to drag on that. And now we have our skin tones locked in. So that's the first thing I'm going to adjust. Just going to have a look at that. So for making sure that we get the right skin tones, I'm going to switch to the vector scope down here. And I have the skin tone indicator on, which is this line here. So if I turn it off, you can see that we have this line here. I can already see now that this is probably skin tones and they lie a little bit to the right. So we're going to fix that by taking the hue here. I actually want to stretch it out a little bit for what it selects here, just to make sure that we get all the tones in their skins. And then I'm just going to drag it up and down a little bit according to what I can see this little part here move. It's going to be right around the middle of this line. So you can just see if I move it, you can see how much it moves around. But just by moving it slightly and slightly down, you can see that now we get some nicer skin tones. We can see if we zoom in that before it was more magenta, and now it's a little bit more brown skin color-ish. I don't know how to say that exactly, but we're going to do the same thing with the saturation. Just spread out the selection here a little bit. I'm going to see if we want to add, maybe want to add a little bit of saturation to their skin just to make sure they stand out a little bit more. And for the luminance, I'm going to increase it just a little bit as well to make sure that they just get some nice light on there. And look at that. I think that's pretty good. Actually, I'm going to take back some of that saturation because I don't want it to be unnatural. So something like this. I think that's pretty good. Now we corrected the skin tones. They look much better already. For the next things, I want to do a little bit with the greens here. I want to make sure that her dress is completely white. And then I want to make sure that his jacket stands out a little bit. So for all 3 of the different channels here, we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to drag on the greens. I'm going to drag on his blue shirt here. And I'm going to drag on her white dress. And that seemed to be wrong. It's not supposed to lie in the skin tones. Okay. Let's see what we have to work with. The greens lie around there. His blue shirt there. And her dress is somehow in the red area, which I find to be a little bit weird. But that's probably because we added too much warmth in the primaries. So we're doing the same thing here with all of these. Now, I don't think I'm going to change much with the hues for all of them, but for the greens, I want to push them a little bit to the warmer side. They just get that warm tint instead of being all green. We might want to take that back again afterwards, but let's just see. For the saturation, let's just see what happens if we drag it up or down. We could take away a little bit of the focus here by desaturating them, but I think it's a bit of a shame since it's actually some nice green tones. So I'm actually gonna increase them just a slight bit, and then we can always desaturate on our outside node a little bit later. And for our luminance, let's drag this out a little bit. Just see what we want to do. I want to increase the luminance a little bit of the greens as well. So we basically just went from this a little bit more greener tone to something that's slightly warmer. It's very subtle, I know, but I'm not going to make huge adjustments for this. We want to kind of get to a neutral and nice looking image and not something that's overly edited, because again, this is from a wedding shoot or wedding celebration, some kind of that. So we want to make sure that it looks good. So for our hue versus hue here, I'm just going to see what happens when we try to adjust the jacket here. And we're not hitting the entire jacket, so I want to make sure that we get the entire selection. There we go. I'm not going to do much. I'm just going to see if we want to make it, push it a little bit to the teal side here. Not being exactly sure what the jacket looked like in real life, but just making sure that we have it in a nice color here. And I want to make it stand out a little bit, so I'm just going to increase the saturation a little bit. And also for the luminance, I'm gonna make sure that it stands out just a tiny bit. So again, this is very subtle. You can almost can't see it, but I think it's still worth doing. Then for the hue, I'm not gonna touch the hues for the dress. The only thing I wanna check is that it actually is where it says that it's being affected, which doesn't seem to be the case. Now here I can see we have more going on, which makes sense because usually I find that the dress lies somewhere around this area of the blues. The whites usually gets a little bit into that blue area. So I'm just gonna reset these nodes, and then I'm gonna hit into my saturation. I'm going to make sure that our jacket here is going to be set pretty well in there. And then I'm going to take this point and I'm gonna desaturate it. I'm desaturating these colors just to make sure that we have pure white in the dress. And let's just make sure that that's the case. Yeah, we can see it's a little bit warmer now. I'm just desaturating quite a bit. So I'm gonna make sure that I actually desaturate it completely. And I think we have that now. And then for the luminance, we can always just drag that up a little bit, like so, because we already have everything else dragged up and increased a little bit. So let's just do the same here. Again, it's very subtle, but now we got a nice white dress. Actually, it looks like it is a little bit towards the tealer tones here. And that's probably because we pushed the hue up here. Let's just reset that and make sure that it just stays white. And by that, we also need to turn that off. I think that's pretty good. So we ignored what we did with the jacket. I took that back because we want to make sure that the dress is white and those are overlapping a little bit. So I'm just going to leave it there. We weren't doing a lot to the jacket anyway. So let's leave it at that. And the only last thing I want to do is I want to go into the saturation. I want to take the sat versus loom. I just want to see where their skin tones lie in this. So they lie at this area. And what you can do with the sat versus loom is just increase the contrast a little bit in the different levels of saturation. So I'm going to drag this up ever so slightly. I'm going to zoom in just to make sure that I can see what we're doing. Just going to zoom in a little bit here, get some brighter skin tones, and then I'm going to make everything a little bit darker. Something like this. You can see I'm almost barely moved it, but it just gave us a little bit more contrast. It actually flattened out the dress quite a bit. So I'm just going to see if we can just increase it a little bit more. I think this is very nice. So it just gives us some more contrast and also puts some more light on our subjects here. So for now, we've gone from, after our conversion, we've gone from this, which was our kind of pure Rec 709 conversion, to this, which already looks a lot better. Our color grade alone did this. So we went from this image after we color corrected to this, which is a little bit warmer and has some more contrast in the highlights. And now we're going to move to my favorite part, which is our focus or our masks here. So the reason why I've decided to call it a focus mask is because I want to create more contrast on our subjects in here, and that way draw the attention to our subject. So I'm gonna go to the first frame because in this case they're moving. So we're gonna do a little bit of a trick to make sure that everything looks nice and neat. I'm gonna make a circular mask. You could also use the magic mask, but it's gonna be too demanding on the computer, and I actually usually struggle a little bit more using the magic mask because it has some struggles with the selection sometimes. So what I want to do here is I want to create a mask around our subjects, and I want to make sure that we get some more contrast on them. So I'm going to go to the contrast curve again, or the custom curve. I'm just going to make a little bit of contrast on them particularly. Now it's difficult to see because it's so small, but before I zoom in and check exactly what we're doing, I want to make sure that when they walk, that the mask follows them. But I don't want the mask to be all of this area when there's this small. So I want it to kind of to be natural and flowing with them. So as we're at the first frame here, we can head into our tracking window here. But instead of having it track it for us, which is usually is pretty good at, I'm just going to do it manually. So I'm going to head into frame. I'm going to put a keyframe on our first frame here. So this just tells it that this power window should stay here at this size at this exact frame, which is the first frame. Now I'm going to move in a little bit more into the scene and see, okay, this is probably the furthest we would go with the scene. So I'm just going to increase our mask here now. Might feather it out a little bit more, something like this. I think that looks pretty good. And then just see how that flows together. So let's see. I think it increases the mask a little bit too fast. So I think around somewhere here, just want to make it a little bit smaller to make sure that it flows a little bit better. And play it back again and see how that works. I think that's better. Just makes it flow a little bit better, and then it becomes a little bit too large at the end or fast maybe, but you're not gonna notice that when it plays through. Let's go back to our contrast here. Let's stop around here, zoom in a little bit, and maybe around here actually, just to see what we're doing. You can see with our contrast curve here, we're creating a lot more contrast. So let's just try and fine tune this a little bit. Make them stand out, and now they became a little bit too dark for my opinion. So just gonna switch back to the waveform. I'm gonna pull up the gamma here just a little bit, maybe around 2 or 3, and then reduce the lift by 1, something like this, because now we got more contrast, but we didn't really lose any luminance. We just increased the contrast a little bit. I think that's pretty good. That'll just make them stand out a little bit more. It also makes them look a little bit sharper than the way before, especially when we compare, which is always a little bit of a dangerous thing to do because it can be difficult to see when you go back and forth if it's looking good or not. But after doing this so many times, I think this is looking pretty good and pretty neat. So we have our focus mask now. I don't want to do anything more to this part, but I also put an outside node on, which you do by right-clicking and adding a node and then an outside node. An outside node is basically selecting everything that we aren't selecting in the first node. So our first node here is selecting everything inside the circle, and it's of course making it smaller and larger depending on which direction we go in, from small to large, of course, if we go in the natural direction. And if I select the other node, you can see that it'll just follow the exact same thing and select everything outside it. Now, because it's feathered so much, I can actually see that we might need to do a slight change in the softening here. So let's just make sure that it looks good. I think this is a little bit better so that we still make sure that we don't affect our subjects here too much. Now, what I want to do here is just to go into our primaries again. I'm just going to reduce the gamma a little bit. I might increase the gain a tiny bit as well, and maybe reduce the lift. Just play around with it to make sure that we just get a nice vignette that just draws the attention a little bit more to our subject. Something like this. And now overall, I think everything maybe looks a little bit dark. So I'm actually just going to increase the exposure a little bit. And now I think this looks pretty good. So when I turn the focus mask off, I'm also kind of turning the outside node off, because then it's not selecting anything. So you can just see what that did for us. It made it stand out quite a bit more and just made it look a little bit nicer in my opinion. Now for our next mask, we're going to do a highlight mask. So I'm going to select power window here. And before I do that, actually, what I want to show you is that when we go into full screen here, what I analyzed from the image before we started is that the light is coming from somewhere up here, because you can see that his face is illuminated here, or maybe it's actually coming from behind, but somewhere up, because when we move around, if you look at his shadows down here, you can see they're coming slightly from this direction, but it's not a lot. So it's coming from pretty far up, pretty much straight above them, and then giving this nice and soft shadow, which is also why the light is so nice. It looks like it was shot at some good lighting at least, and this lantern is turned on, so that probably means that it was early or late in the day. With knowing that the highlight mask here is going to be placed somewhere up here, because I want to make sure that we kind of emulate that. So what I like to do is just make the softening 100, because then I have a little bit more gradient to play around with. So I'm going to hit Shift H to see what I'm doing. And I'm going to move this up quite a bit. So maybe move it in a little bit and something like this. Maybe make sure that I want them to be touched by this light that we're going to create, but not too much, because everything still has to be natural. I think this is pretty good. Heading into the custom curve here, I can make a highlight curve here that just goes up, leaving everything alone. And I'm going to drag the whites down just to make sure that it's not too much. And you can see we're just brightening up the scene overall up here, creating a little bit more depth or contrast in the scene, if you will. And then I'm just going to add a little bit of warmth. So around 3 red and 2 green. We're just going to make it way too much. You can see that now it's just kind of yellow, which is not what we want. Maybe actually we want to remove 1 green just to make it a little bit more red and warm. But that's where the dehaze one comes in. This is just another serial node, but I've connected the 2 blue in and out points here, which basically just means that we are taking the key or the mask from the first node to the second node as well. So this one will only affect everything that we'd selected in the first one. So doing the opposite of the outside node that's selecting everything else, this is just selecting the exact same thing without having to do the same mask. So I'm going to head into my effects and search for dehaze. And this is where we go. And now I'm going to make this negative 0.1. That just softens up everything a little bit. Make sure that we get rid of some of that yellow tint. And just makes it warmer, but in a nice, soft way. So this mask has basically just done this, gives us a little bit more contrast and light up here. I want to do kind of the opposite with the shadow mask here. So I'm going to make, for the first time in this video, a rectangular mask. Just going to drag this down quite a bit. And we want to kind of go somewhat opposite of the light. So we made our light come in from up here. So I'm going to make it with a slight angle, I think. Maybe actually get quite a bit of an angle, something like this. Let's see how that works. I think actually we're going to go something like this instead, just to create more meaningful contrast in the scene. Something like this. And I'm going to do the opposite. So I'm just going to make a shadow mask here. Don't want to go too strong, so I'm going to lift up the blacks as well. Just going to see somewhere around here. We could add some teal into this, but I think for this image particularly, we're not going to do that. So essentially what we've done with our masks now is we went from this to this, which just, when you take them all off at once and put them back together, I think it makes a huge difference. This is what we came from, which looks a little bit flat now, but this is a very nice image. This is something that you could definitely use if you don't want to do all the masking, but just adding the masks here, I think that just creates a lot more depth and contrast, and I think it looks very nice. If you play it back, it looks like this, which I think is a very nice image. So let's just pause it here and just see what we've done with all of our color grading. So we went from this after our color correction to this image now that looks, in my opinion at least, very nice. I think this is a very good image, and I really like the colors that came out of that FX3. It looks so good and it's so nice to work with. It really is a great file and great colors, and yeah, I get why people are so excited by this camera in particular. So when you have this, if you just throw some kind of wedding music on and some bells from a church, it'll look like this. And that is all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed this being a little bit different from what I'm otherwise grading, which is usually some travel kind of tropical vibes, I guess. I think this was a lot of fun to grade and almost got me excited to do weddings. I think that's a little bit too nerve-wracking for me, but I think it's fun. And if you're going to do any kind of wedding color grading, or you shoot weddings yourself, I hope this helped you a little bit to get some maybe nicer grades, or at least some techniques that you can use for your next grading project. So with that said, I'll leave it at that, and I'll see you in the next video.